Great.
Okay, so thanks everyone for hopping on. My name is Mike McDermott, and I'm with the Credit Union Wealth Group. On with us as well is also Evan Kulak. And we're going to be going through a brief presentation today on retirement planning and some of the benefits of it. With the Credit Union Wealth Group, we are a wealth management firm. We work with WyHy members to offer wealth management services. So that's financial planning and advice, as well as investment services too. And a common thing that we do hear from members, or a common question, is retirement planning and what should be considered about retirement planning. What are kind of the key areas to think about, and what decisions can really impact or improve our chances of success or meeting our goals for retirement. There's certainly other things that we can discuss as well, and we're certainly happy to set up calls or individual meetings for anyone to cover anything in particular. So today we'll cover some of the key areas though in retirement. Hopefully it can be something that's at least a useful starting point. If you have started retirement planning, that's fantastic. If you have not, it's never too late. And even if you have a retirement plan in place, it's always a good idea to get a second opinion, or to just even do a check-in once in a while to make sure you're still on track and see if you might need to make any adjustments. So as I mentioned here, I'm sharing my screen now. You should be able to see a picture of myself here. My name is Mike McDermott, and also with us is Evan Kulak. I'll give Evan a chance to say hello here before we keep going.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking the time. As Mike mentioned, my name is Evan Kulak. I'm one of the financial advisors who works closely with the team at WyHy. I'm looking forward to answering any questions that you guys have and learning more about your financial situation and see how we can help you with retirement planning.
Thanks, Evan. So as you think about retirement planning, the first thing we kind of like to point out is that, as I mentioned, it is one of the bigger, more common goals that we see. And this is just a statistic from a survey taken last year on retirement goals and plans across America. And the result was that of the group that was surveyed, which was almost 4,000 people, about 46% of the American households surveyed were at risk of not being able to cover essential expenses in retirement. So those are just the fundamentals of everyday living. Almost half Americans were at risk of not being able to meet those needs. So this is something that certainly needs to be addressed, and certainly an area that we want to put high on the priority list as we think about our financial situation and our financial future, especially in our household. What we'll go through today are the 5 key areas of retirement, things to consider. We'll also take a quick look at a Social Security breakdown, and then how we could best approach creating a retirement plan, as well as any actions that we can take. And we can leave it open for Q&A at the end. If you do have any questions too, you can also put it into the chat feature as well. And we'll have our contact information up here also, so we can certainly set up a separate meeting if you wanted to dive a little bit deeper. Our information is also available on the WyHy website, so feel free to check it out there. Another survey that we had pulled up and looked at was thinking about planning for the unexpected. Another survey here with a group of roughly 3,000 to 4,000 people, I think, again, surveyed individuals that were between the ages of 50 and 64, and of those that had retired within the past 3 years, over 56% of them had retired earlier than expected, and that was due to typically changes in employment or medical concerns. And the key takeaway there really was thinking about our retirement plan is great, and it's certainly an important thing to tackle, but we also have to be ready for the unexpected. We also have to be ready for a possible early retirement. What would happen if we did have a medical concern, or really a big change in one of our life events, or unemployment if there's downsizing or layoffs? What would we do if we had to retire earlier? So we really want to have an extra cushion or buffer to think about those alternative plans that might come up. The key things that we want to think about would definitely be our expenses in retirement. And there are 4 key areas that we would think about for those fundamentals, those essential expenses. And that would be our housing, our transportation, food, and then healthcare. And the percentages up above are the typical allocation of where we see most of a member's funds go to in retirement. And so you can see housing is a big one, transportation and food, and then healthcare. And that is a variable too, because as we get older and at risk for more different diseases or health concerns, those medical expenses can grow significantly. So what we'll need to think about is our nest egg, but also where do we have our money coming from? So we have our savings, of course. We might have investments. We might have any type of physical assets or real estate. We also can break it down into reliable and other income sources. So reliable and almost variable income sources. A reliable income source might be our pension. So if we work maybe for the state or the government, we may have a pension available to us. That's a very great income source that we can lean on in retirement. We also might have Social Security payments. Those are consistent. Sometimes we might have annuities as well. In today's day and age, we don't typically see or recommend annuities as a new product that people should get into, but some of them are beneficial in the past. So if you have an annuity that has guaranteed payments, that can be helpful, but also any type of investment account that's been growing over time and has been allocated properly and has above average or satisfactory performance. That can be a really good income source to draw down from. So other things could also be any real estate. If we have any life insurance payments or a health savings account, those are also useful. Income from part-time work, that's a great way to supplement some of the income that we might need in retirement. And that's something that we can control and adjust as things change throughout the course of our retirement. Another factor to consider would be the length that we're going to be retired. So across the board, Americans are living longer, and that's something we're going to dive deeper into, what that effect can have on our retirement funds. But we may very well be retired for 20 plus years. If we were to retire at 65 and live to 85, that's 20 years of potentially not working. So there's a lot of things that we need to plan for in that time period. And it would be whether or not we can maintain our expected lifestyle. So are we going to be able to live within our means, a life that we're comfortable with and can actually enjoy? Are we going to be able to meet all of our expenses? How should we allocate our money? It's not a matter of just having one lump sum when we turn 65 and retire, and then that's it. We still need to manage our assets in retirement to make sure that we don't outlast our money, because that's another major thing to plan for and consider as well. And then another question could also be, even when should we retire? Should we retire at 65? Could we do it earlier? What would the benefit maybe be of waiting 1 year or 2 years? That can really compound the value of our savings if we have another year or two of income. So those are the things that we do talk to members about, and we do chat with them to see what the impact be. Are we contributing enough to our retirement plan? Do we have all of these different tools available to us are being put to use? And we educate members on that as well in a lot of different conversations. So we'll dive a little bit deeper down to some of these key areas, and the 5 key risks, as I mentioned. We're going to look at longevity, so how long we're living in retirement. But then also we'll take a look at healthcare expenses, and also, you might have seen in the news over the past couple of months, inflation especially is a really big concern. So how can that affect our savings? And then what would we be able to do with our investments? What would be the best approach for us to look at from an investment standpoint? And then lastly, outliving our money. So from here, I'm going to pass it over to Evan, and he'll be able to dive us a little bit deeper into each one of these key risk areas.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. So the first one we'll cover is longevity. So as Mike mentioned earlier, the average life expectancy is increasing at a pretty rapid rate in America, which is a good thing, but it raises an extra risk, which is that you might outlive your money. So a lot of people, when they get close to retirement or near retirement, they tend to take down a lot of the risk in their portfolio and say, well, now I need income because I'm going to have to withdraw funds to maintain my lifestyle. But it's really important to consider that you're probably going to live 20 plus years in retirement, and you're going to want to have freedom and flexibility to live the lifestyle that you want. So you're going to need your investments to grow for a longer time period than you did 30, 40 years before. It's just something to keep in mind. You're probably going to live longer than you expected. And in tune with living longer comes in. Go ahead, Mike. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
In tune with living longer comes greater healthcare expenses. So Mike had mentioned inflation earlier. So there's been general inflation of 8.5%, but healthcare inflation is really averaging in the double digits. That cost is expected to rise, especially as you live longer. There's going to be more treatments that you're going to need. You're probably going to be on certain drugs longer. There's going to be maybe more mobility services that you're going to need. So healthcare expenses are something that gets overlooked a lot in retirement. You just want to remember that they're going to probably make up the bulk of your retirement spending. So just something to keep an eye on there. There are things you can do to help limit your exposure, such as investing in saving in a health savings plan, looking at long-term care insurance, and potentially setting up some type of estate plan to help you be able to cover those costs. All right. So as we mentioned earlier, inflation, that's kind of the red herring in all of this. So the last 20, 30 years, basically since the early 80s, inflation has been pretty low. So since 2010, inflation was not really even to get above the Federal Reserve's target of 2%. But now we have inflation at 8.5%. It's likely going to reach double digits in the next couple of months here. And what inflation does is it erodes your purchasing power. So the way to think about inflation is, let's say you had $100, but inflation is increasing at a rate of 10%. Well, now your $100 can only buy $90 worth of goods. So inflation is basically a silent tax, and you want to be very cautious of it because it results in your cost of living going up. But your investments have to keep up with the rate of inflation to match that. So fortunately for Social Security, there's what's known as a COLA, or cost of living adjustment. So that moves relative to what's known as the Consumer Price Index. So there is a little bit of a built-in inflation hedge with Social Security. But for your pension investments, your 401ks and the IRAs, they are traditionally not optimized for a rising rate and rising inflationary environment. And that's kind of a newer risk that you're going to have to be wary of as you get closer into your retirement. So as I mentioned earlier, you're going to have an investment mix that's probably a little bit more aggressive than what you're typically used to in retirement. So if you look at this chart here, you'll see the rising costs. You have inflation at 3%, healthcare costs at 5.4%. Those metrics are from last year. Those numbers have both basically doubled, and the inflation number has doubled even more than that. So you're really going to want to make sure you're protected against inflation and those healthcare costs. And if you notice to the left of on the left of the blue bar chart, you'll see the green bar chart. And there you'll see that a growth portfolio, which typically averages 8.94%, is barely outpacing the rate of current inflation at 8.5%. That touches on what we mentioned earlier, which is you're probably going to need a more aggressive mix of investments to be able to keep up with the rate of inflation. All right. So one item you want to look at is most of you are going to be eligible for Social Security. We typically recommend that members reach out to the Social Security office to get your Social Security initial benefits around age 60. And it'll basically show you what your different benefits are going to be, what your different options are, and we're happy to look at those options and kind of work them into your retirement plan to figure out when's the optimal time for you to take Social Security based on your financial situation, your other investments, as well as your kind of goals in retirement. Traditionally with Social Security, the longer you wait, the bigger your return will get in terms of the payments that you'll get from Social Security. For most of the time, we're going to probably encourage people to wait until after age 67, if possible. By no means is that set in stone. Everyone's situation is different, but the longer you wait, the more your payments will be for life. And if you're going to live longer, you're really going to want to have to lock in those higher payments. Okay. So for some government workers, there are a few items that you have to be careful of that may affect your Social Security. So some government workers just aren't eligible for Social Security. Others, there's a windfall elimination provision. There's also a government pension offset. If you think those may apply to you, please let Mike or myself know. We're happy to chat with you about that and see if there's a workaround, or we can adjust your retirement plan for that. Not overly common, but just something to be aware of for government workers. So we kind of identified the 5 risks in retirement. We also talked about you're going to have inflation, and that's kind of a new phenomenon that many of us haven't experienced since I mentioned the early 80s. So what you're going to want to do is build a retirement income plan. And essentially the way this is going to work is you're going to want to match your retirement liabilities to your retirement assets and your future cash flow income streams. So kind of the way to think about it is you can make a list of essentially what all your liabilities are going to be in retirement. Your daily cost of living, whether you think you're going to need certain types of healthcare, what your travel plans are, basically map all of those items out. Then we're going to map them to which assets can cover those liabilities. And then we're also going to figure out then if you want to live this certain lifestyle in retirement, what type of income do you need to generate from your investments to be able to support that? Do you need a 5% rate of return? Do you need a 6% rate of return? Do you need a 10% rate of return? Those are the types of, the retirement income plan basically gets the ball rolling on those items. So as we mentioned earlier, there are guaranteed investments and non-guaranteed investments. So most of your money today is going to come from non-guaranteed investments. That's going to be the 62% on this chart here. That's your own sources. So that's going to be any 401ks you had, any IRA accounts, any CD investments. That's where that money is going to come from. About 40% is going to come from guaranteed sources, so pension and Social Security. So it's critical that you focus on the bulk of your retirement savings is going to be in those non-guaranteed pieces, and you're going to want to make sure that those are optimized correctly. You're going to have a gap between your guaranteed and non-guaranteed assets. And what you're going to want to have to figure out is what are your essential expenses in retirement? So, for example, healthcare, mortgages, those items you're going to want to have fully guaranteed, fully covered by your guaranteed income sources. And the reason for that is you don't want to have a year where something like 2008 happens or when the COVID crisis hit, and there's a pretty big drop in the stock market and the bond market. And now if you're using your non-guaranteed income to cover these essential expenses that you have to pay, and they're typically on a reoccurring basis, you don't want to be pulling down from your non-guaranteed accounts when they're already significantly down because of the market movement. So you're going to want to protect yourself there. What we recommend doing, if possible, once again, everyone's situation is unique, you want to take money from the guaranteed sources and be able to have that money cover your mortgage, healthcare expenses as best as it can, and that will reduce a lot of the risk for you running out of your money in retirement.
Hey, thanks, Evan. So that was a lot to cover. I know, there's a lot of different areas, and different members have different priorities they want to talk about with us or dive deeper into or even get more information on. We're happy to share more information as well. The slide here now I have just kind of pointing out how a financial advisor can definitely help. It is good, as I mentioned, to at least have a second opinion, even if anyone has an advisor already. Make sure you at least chat with them, and if you haven't had anyone else take a look at what their recommendations are, it is typically good to get another consultation. Those are usually free, and we certainly will give a free consultation for any member. The statistic up here, too, is kind of interesting that only 23% of American households actually have a relationship with a financial advisor, which means over 75% of those households are actually going at this on their own. And some people are very financially savvy, and they are certainly capable of taking everything into their own hands, but there never really is any downside to at least having a chat with someone else who's a licensed professional. And that's part of what we do with the credit union members here, is make ourselves available to answer any questions, help plan together, as well as actually enact that plan. So not just having a plan of action, but also taking the steps to put it into motion. And we do certainly encourage everyone to feel comfortable to reach out to us. As I mentioned, our information is available on the WyHy website. So please feel free to take a look at the Wealth Management tab there and schedule some time with us, or give us a call, send us an email. We can try to get any of your questions answered, and also, if you'd like, we can open up different accounts as suitable. So what we'll do now is just pause and see if there's any general questions. Our information, or at least Evan's information, is up here. My information is also on the website, as I mentioned, and we can schedule some kind of separate meetings as well if there's any personalized questions, but any general questions we're happy to answer here also.
I have a question. What accounts do you recommend starting with?
That's a great question.
Sure.
It can depend on each individual. What we'd like to typically do is go through a discovery session with each members to see what is their current situation, and then also what are their goals. If we were thinking about retirement, we might think about, do we have a retirement plan set up through work? Is there a pension? Is there a 401k or 403b? And do we need any assistance with that? And then also an IRA, an individual retirement account, can be very useful as a retirement tool. So we might position that as a next step. And then separately, we could do an individual account. So it can depend. Sometimes and oftentimes we'll actually have multiple different accounts, and it'll be a question of which one do we want to start with first, or which makes the most sense for the member, and then kind of organize it that way.
Okay. Thanks.
Absolutely.
I guess
Any
my
other
other
questions?
question would, I have another one. So like you talked about with inflation going up right now, what are you seeing that people that are about to retire, what do you see is working well for them?
Sure, yeah, absolutely, good question. So what we've been doing to help retirees prepare for rising inflation is basically shifting the asset allocation in their portfolios. And what I mean by that is shifting the mix of investments that they have in either their 401k, IRAs with us, or in general investment accounts. We've been in the last, basically since 2008, we've been in a period in which if you owned a stock and bond portfolio, it had done exceptionally well. The last actually 10 years, so if you go back to 2012, has been the highest returning on a risk-adjusted basis for like a 60% stock, 40% bond portfolio. So we've been a very favorable environment to risk assets. That is now changing. It looks like the money printing from the Fed, there's a lot of deglobalization going on, which is inflationary, coupled with some demographic shifts, are causing us to have higher inflation than was probably expected. So we've been shifting client portfolios into gold, some commodity allocation. There's also things known as inflation-protected bonds. Those are bonds whose interest rates basically move with the rate of inflation. And then you also have to be cautious in an inflationary environment of the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. And actually, the Federal Reserve is going to announce today how much they're going to raise interest rates by. So you want to be hedged against that as well. So it's basically been shifting the allocation into assets that do well in an inflationary environment.
Okay, great. And what do you think are the least risky options out there right now?
Sure. So the least risky options in an inflationary environment would be floating rate treasury bonds. And what those are is they're treasury bonds whose rates adjust as the Federal Reserve raises rates. The reason that's important is because typically when rates rise, bond prices fall. So they're inversely related. So you're going to want bonds that do well in a rising rate environment. The other piece is what I mentioned earlier, which is the inflation-protected bonds. Those are bonds who are indexed to the rate of inflation. So there's treasury bonds, so they're treasury and inflation-protected bonds. And when inflation rises, their principal matches the rate of inflation. So let's say you had $100 in these bonds and inflation goes up by 8.5%. The principal on those bonds will go from $100 to $108.50. So it's a nice way to hedge against inflation. Gold is another inflationary hedge. It is a little more volatile than the bonds, but given that your question was around what are the most conservative investments, I would recommend those two types of treasury inflation-protected bonds and the treasury floating rate bonds.
Okay, great. And then I have one more, if no one else has one to go with. But I'm wondering where you suggest someone start when looking at looking into retirement funds. What's the best place to start with?
Sure. So I think the best place to start when you're looking at retirement funds is just from an organizational perspective. So typically if someone gets closer to retirement, or even if they're still in the accumulation stage, they're going to have old 401ks at other companies. They might have a pension somewhere. They might have IRA accounts. Just important to organize everything. And the financial advisor, Mike and myself, can definitely help with this, just to get everything laid out to make sure that you know exactly what your assets are and what your future benefits are going to be as well. And then from there, you can really do some holistic planning and make sure that you're including every account and how it's going to be mapped out in the future. So that's where I recommend starting.
Okay. Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, thank you everyone for joining, and certainly again, we can be contacted. Our information is on the WyHy website, so feel free to reach out to us separately. If you have any questions or would like to schedule a meeting with us, happy to address that. So I saw your message here, Kelly, thank you. We appreciate it. We're here to help the members, so we're happy to offer these sessions. And if there's no other questions, we can go ahead and end the session. I'll stop sharing my screen now. But we appreciate everyone's time today very much. And again, we're here to help. So please feel free to reach out to us with anything that we might be able to help you with.
Great. Well, thank you both very much.
Yes, absolutely.
You're welcome, and thank you.